Shabbat Shalom, everyone. We are so thrilled to get to have the opportunity for a bit more of an intimate conversation with Chancellor Eisen. And I'm going to start off by asking you something that you alluded to in your remarks during your Devar Torah. You've spent your career teaching theology, other people's theologies. And after all this time, you felt moved to write your own. And I wonder if you could explain more, what made you feel called to do that? If you felt like you needed permission to do that, and the process by which you came to write this very personal book.
Thank you. It's hard for me to answer the question because I can answer the question about the process, but why I decided to do this, I would have to do a long period of therapy probably to figure out why it is. But the pieces that I'm aware of was, I thought it was about time, and I felt I had a nagging sense that I was avoiding something. When you teach other people's Jewish thought all the time and you don't give yourself any kind of a coherent account of what you believe, why are you not doing that? You must be avoiding it. And as I mentioned last night, this thing about turning 70 really was something to me. I mean, I don't know why it is. There are probably people here who passed that mark and look back on it fondly. But for me, I was saying it shortens the horizon. And if you're not going to do it now, you're probably never going to do it. So it was just a sense that I've got to do this. And for some reason, I really wanted my kids, it mattered to me. We have two kids, one 40 and one in his mid-30s, and we wanted them to know, I wanted them to know what I thought. And I had to figure it out. So I think that's as much of an answer as I can give you. I suspect there was one more reason. I think I was afraid that I would find out that I believed less than I wanted to. And like if I examine this up close, I'm going to find out that I really don't believe all these things I was acting as if I believed. And in the end, I found out that I don't know if I don't like the word belief in this connection, but I believed more than I thought I did and had more of a relationship to God once I understood that I was in good company in the history of the Jewish tradition in not necessarily having God up close, but having glimpses, and what the sociologist Peter Berger calls a rumor of angels or a signal of transcendence. And in my case, I like this idea of glimpses and occasional visits and longing and encounter and service, and really believing that when we do certain things in the world, we're doing, quote, what God wants us to do, end quote, even though I can't give you a rational account of what those words, what God wants, mean.
I obviously can't answer for you, but I just want to
answer for you.
I want to riff. I want to say a couple of things. One, it is a good challenge because I have not written a personal theology. I also want to, again, we don't have two lives, and I'm grateful for the life that I lived. And in not going to the seminary, I'm also very aware that I missed the chance to study in a formal class with Neil Gilman, of blessed memory.
Do you all know who Neil Gilman was? You have to tell them who Neil Gilman was.
Why don't you tell them?
Well, Neil Gilman was a philosopher and a professor at JTS, and his real passion in life, I believe it's fair to say, was getting Jews of all sorts to think about God. And he wrote 2 books addressed to regular people, like not scholars. One's called Sacred Fragments, where he wants to tell you that if you have fragments, you don't have it all put together, but you have fragments of experiences and beliefs, and that's all you need really, is start there. And then he wrote a book called Doing Your Own Theology. And I have a sense that here right now, or when I talk to Jews around the country in connection with this book, I'm channeling my former colleague Neil Gilman. who was on the interview committee the day I was almost hired by JTS in 1986 and then decided not to go there. That's another story for another time. But anyway, go ahead.
No, and from what I understand, one of the things that you did in Neil's class is he would really push you to write your own theology, and he gave you a structure to do that with a series of questions. And
that's right. That's what he did for students at JTS. That's right.
Yeah. And so number one, I take this as a good, as a good impetus, as a challenge, as something I should do myself. The other thing I want to react to what you said. I think this idea of teaching your children, giving something your children to grab onto is really important. And I want to just say, I was not the USY kid growing up. Most people know this. I was a swimmer. I peripherally involved. My dad actually took us to shul a couple times a month, and so it was like a little more. I wasn't a 3-day-a-year Jew, but I still was very peripheral. What exactly, the whole idea of praying wasn't something that I was familiar with until I went to Israel when I was 23 years old. That's the first time I would say I encountered somebody praying it was beyond melodies. And I'm mentioning this because I think, I don't want to say it's a failure because I'll be easier on myself in this way, but when you don't grow up taught or sort of absorbing, as you were talking about, you saw your mom light Shabbos candles, you had your father bless. I didn't have that. And so I actually struggled as a father with how to teach that to my kids. And I fell back on the experiences. What I wanted to do was our kids, they know what it means to be blessed. And they know what it means to have a Shabbos table and to light candles. But in terms of actually talking to my kids about God as a commander or God as, love, or just speaking about God, it was actually foreign for me. And so it was not something that I know that I articulated well for my own kids, and probably something I need to, work on articulating for myself too.
That brings up a question I had, which is that, Dr. Eisen, you write that you were not raised expecting God to intervene in individual lives, and that, in fact, not to save particular people. How did that shape your theology, as we're talking about how our growing up sometimes is a piece that shapes our theology? And how did it perhaps protect you from doubts that might have destroyed other people's faith? And also, I'm just curious kind of how you came to that and how it works in your life.
Yeah, that's right. So I talked last night about Richard Rubenstein, the theologian who came to belief in God, I think in college, and he said it was intellectual, it was rational, and then the Holocaust destroyed it. And I had in front of me the example of a great rabbi in America, Yitzhak Greenberg, who wrote extensively about the Holocaust, raised as an Orthodox Jew, and he had a firm belief that God is involved in history, especially the history of the Jewish people. And the Holocaust shook him, and he's written about that really eloquently. He just wrote another book in his 90s explaining, he developed a whole theology about how God has gone through various phases in the history of humanity. And he believes that God was actually closer to us, and God has actually withdrawn. And in this third phase, which is the phase we're in right now, God says, okay, it's up to you. You blow it, but I'm out of here, right? And that's his explanation for the Holocaust. And as I said, I lost these two brothers who were born after me. And I didn't talk about this, but I had a next door neighbor who wasn't my best friend, but we knew each other quite well. And he was murdered when he was 18 years old. And I was like 15 or 16. And that made an impact on me. And I had a cousin who drowned. And I had death around me. and never believed that God had singled me out for life and decided that they were not going to get to live. And so for some reason, maybe because we don't have my family, I have no intimate family that went through the Holocaust, no survivors in my family. So when I first encountered all this literature, which literally dominated the field of American Judaism for 20 or 30 years, for me, it was not quite academic because I want to know that God is in the world, but I never wrestled seriously with this issue. It never was an issue for me.
I want to bring Rabbi Greyber into the conversation
Because
you wrote a book.
You wrote a book about loss.
About your personal loss,
Exactly.
Faith Unravels, and you grappled with it as a rabbi, as a human being. And I'm interested to hear you describe your orientation to the belief or the doubt that God intervenes to save individuals' lives.
That was a big challenge for me. I had a best friend of mine, who was my friend from high school and from college, who died of leukemia. And then a few years later, Jennifer and my real best friend, father who was raising, they had 3 boys, we have 3 boys, and we were sort of raising our kids together. And he was a rabbinical student and amazing song leader at Camp Ramon, California that I was running. He was diagnosed and died of leukemia, and I sort of experienced that second death. I was reliving the first death, and for me it was a crisis. And I remember writing about this in the book that I was glad I wasn't a synagogue rabbi at the time, because I did not feel like I felt I was drowning, and I did not have the ability to help other people with this. And in some ways I was insulated from that task because I was running the camp, and I wasn't in the direct work of consoling people. And for me, the liturgy was extremely painful. The second blessing of the Amidah, and there are dozens of examples of this, but the second blessing of the Amidah describes God as a sovereign, Melech Meimitu Mechayeh, right? As a God who Meimit means causes death and brings to life and causes salvation. But I got stuck on that causes death, and it was very painful for me to wake up and to need to say words of blessing to God who killed my friends, who killed people who I loved. And I wrote about my experiences, and I finished writing about those experiences when I was on sabbatical between Ramah and coming here. Those of you who have been part of the synagogue for a long time know that I was hired and then spent a year in Israel. Rabbi Frank Fisher, alav hashalom, was our interim rabbi for the year, so that I could go and have that fellowship. And I finished writing about it. And in the process of getting it published, I sent off a copy of the book to Rabbi Kushner, alav hashalom, Rabbi Harold Kushner, who, he wrote, I would argue, probably the most influential book of Judaism, besides the Bible, right, in the 21st century. No, really, it's been translated into 35 or 40 languages. It's been read by people all around the world, and it's called When Bad Things Happen to Good People. And his essential answer was he does not believe that the answer of the rabbis, Olam kamin hago noheg, the world goes according to its way, that God does not kill people with cancer, okay? And I asked him to blurb my book, and he said, I'm happy to read your book, but I want you to know I'm a tough grader, and I almost never do this, so don't get hurt or insulted if I say no. And I said, the fact that you're writing me back is like having a member of the Supreme Court, like, great. Oh my God, you're reading it. Fantastic. So he wrote me back and he said, I'm not going to do the blurb. I said, okay. And he said, I think that you should wait 5 years. Okay. And I now understand what he meant. Okay. Which is, I now think about this. I would write a very different book now. But the book that I wanted to put into the world was a book, and he was very pained that there was a rabbinic voice that was essentially wrestling with the idea that God kills. And he wasn't comfortable putting his name with that. I respect that and understand that. But I wanted to write a book that was showing the process, and that by wrestling with that idea, you're not crazy and you're not out of, Judaism. And I think the point, to come back to your question, I would describe myself as a theological pragmatist, which is, for many millions of people, Rabbi Kushner's answer works. And it's really important, right, to know that within Judaism, you don't have to believe in a God who kills your friends with cancer, okay, and kills people you love with cancer. There's plenty of theological help there. That's part of the Jewish tradition. But for some people, that idea of God not being in charge is actually more terrifying. And that's not helpful. And so some people need to wrestle with that as part of their story. And my answer, I think, is whatever works. Right? I really think that our notions of God, we have so many notions of God, as you spoke about in services. There is no right. And one of the things I greatly appreciate about your work is the tremendous humility. Right? The first lesson about God is you are not. Okay? If you believe in God, the very next thing is, and it's not you. Right? None of us know, as you said at the end of your Devar Torah, we don't know the answers to these questions. And so as a rabbi, part of what I'm committed to doing is helping people, and maybe helping myself, to figure out what brings comfort, what helps sustain the relationship.
Exactly right. So I left the same thing. If I could just add, we're very much on the same page here. I didn't want to deprive anybody of comfort. And I know there are people, because I've been in houses of mourning, where it's a tremendous comfort to the mourners to believe that God took their loved one, and their loved one is now closer to God than they could have been while on earth. And I don't want to say, you're wrong. Right? So therefore, it's liberating to write a book where I'm not speaking for Judaism. I'm not saying you should believe this. I'm just confessing, okay, at this point in my life, this is what I believe. And someone correctly pointed out at a talk I gave last year that if I had had different experiences of life, my theology would have been different. I don't think I'm getting it right. I'm not getting God right. And therefore, I don't worry that if I had other experiences, I would get God more right. No, I'm not getting God right in this or that one. I'm just putting out there what my current set of convictions and practices is.
I know that you're interviewing. Can I take this moment, since you're here? Okay, I have a question. I want to know what you think of this. I'm a conservative rabbi. This is a conservative synagogue. And I think conservative Judaism, on the whole, made a mistake in late part of the 20th century, in many different writings and places, saying God did not write the Torah, right? And what I mean by that, or in affirming God, as Rabbi Kushner did, he puts it pretty strongly that God, is not involved in the everyday. And there's a difference between saying that is one potential approach versus, and I want to say, I didn't go to JTS, but my impression, what I hear, right, is that for a long time at JTS, there were many rabbinical students who came in with a belief in God, and the academic approach, the Wissenschaft approach to teaching was aggressively negative, right? It's to say, if you believe in God writing the Torah, right, in that, then there's a naivete or even an ignorance, right? And I think that I appreciate your work because to me, it's returning to a sense of humility, right? That let's use our brains, but here are all of the different possibilities.
So I never went to JTS. I thought about it on 3 different occasions. And each time, for some reason, that would be an occasion for therapy also. Why did I decide on 3 different times to approach it and then pull back and not become a rabbi? But the Jewish studies profession opened up as a field exactly when I was ready. And so I chose to do my Jewish teaching, as it were, on the side and teaching universities. But I'm told that that's true. And I think you had a lot of people teaching at JTS for whom they personally, that was a liberating idea, that they had been raised in an Orthodox home and they had come to believe that wasn't true, what they'd been taught. And for them, they were saved for Judaism by this ability to know the JP. And so but they found a certain pleasure in taking Orthodox kids, as it were, right? And depriving them of this naive faith they had and give them the benefit of the doubt. The teachers thought that I'm fortifying them. And I would say for me, getting this at the age of 14 really was fortifying. I didn't go through any shock in college or thereafter to find out that, to the best of our knowledge, God did not write the Torah or dictate it to Moses, because I had rabbis, conservative rabbis, teaching me at the Gratz College High School department who loved Judaism, who loved the Torah, who practiced more than I ever intended to practice, and believed much less than I did. So when you encounter, at the age of 14, you encounter teachers who are more radical in their disbelief than you are, it's shocking, but it's also, what's the word I'm looking for? It fortifies you. It stirs you, right? And that was my experience. Pardon? It inoculates you, and even more, it gives you positive energy. But I think Ben can testify to this much better because Ben teaches at JTS, and Ben invited me to guest teach in his class one day, and there was a student there, I think I told you this, who said, if I did not believe that God wrote the Torah, I could not be a Jew. And there were other students in the class who said, if I did, or if I thought I was supposed to believe that God wrote the Torah, I could not be a Jew. And for me, that is the dialogue between Mordecai Kaplan and Abraham Joshua Heschel, both of whom were at JTS at the same time, and as far as I know, rarely on speaking terms, passed each other in the hall every day, insulted each other publicly on occasion, but were rarely on speaking terms. But the students who got them both were exposed to someone who believed that God was a force or a set of forces at work in the universe, and someone who believed that Moses was a prophet, and that in some way, shape, or form, God gave the Torah. Torah min hashemayim. The Torah is from heaven, gets to us via Moses in a complicated way. So there you go. I don't know the answer to that question, but yes, I take upon myself chatanu, like as the chancellor who succeeded the previous chancellors. I had the same experience at Stanford. You don't tear down someone's belief without giving them something to hold on to in return. So if you're going to tell them it wasn't God, it was JEPD, talking about how the Torah is a sacred book and our lives are dependent on it, and we can love it, why are you here spending your life teaching it, right? That we didn't give enough students.
Thank you. I want to ask you to talk about Hester Panim. You named your book Seeking the Hiding God. Yeah. You didn't name it Seeking
the Hidden God
or the Absent God. And I wonder if you can speak to us about, this seems to me to be, a central precept of the book. And can you speak about that concept?
Yeah, and so the way this, let's think of it as a series of concentric circles in thought. So much of the literature about the Holocaust, insofar as Jews are responding to the Holocaust, falls back on the notion of God hiding God's countenance. So as I mentioned last night, or maybe today, in my bar mitzvah portion, Vayelech, near the end of the book of Deuteronomy, God says, you will rebel against me and I will hide my countenance from you. Astir panai. That's 3 different times God says this. So a lot of Jewish thinkers whom I respect an awful lot, Abraham Joshua Heschel, Eliezer Berkovitz, Joseph Soloveitchik, fall back on this notion of God hiding God's countenance as a way of saying, I think, we don't know. Why did it happen? Richard Rubinstein says, look at the book of Lamentations. Look at what's promised you in the book of Deuteronomy. Look what the Passover Seder says. God did this. And therefore, he turns away from Judaism. And you find examples. The famous one is the Satmar Rebbe, Rabbi Yoel Teitelbaum, who says, yeah, God did this. God's punishing us. It could be for Reform Judaism. It could be for Zionism. Whatever it is, God killed 2 million children and 4 million adults to teach the Jewish people a lesson. By the way, I have, thanks to friends of mine in Israel, I've started following the literature in Israel since October the 7th. And there are Jews in Israel, in good faith, trying to figure out why God did this to us. Why did October the 7th happen? What message was God trying to send? How was God trying to help us? Right? So I can't go there. So Hester Panim is a very attractive option. But there are Jews like Martin Buber, who's very precious to me. And Martin Buber had a famous expression, the eclipse of God. That was his metaphor, the eclipse of God. And it's a lovely metaphor because when you have an eclipse of the sun, you know the sun is still there. And when the moon is eclipsed, the moon is still there, but you can't see it temporarily. So Buber had this notion that there are moments in history where God is hidden from us. And then there are other thinkers. Eliezer Berkovitz was one. Heschel kind of, sort of, sometimes went this far. They draw on the Kabbalistic notion that God practices tzimtzum. God contracts God's self to make room for the rest of the world, to make room for us especially. So God is there, but in mercy to us, God is contracted or hidden or distant, as you said. So this notion of the hiding God, I think I mentioned last night, I would never have dared. I think it's chutzpah to use the word hiding instead of simply saying the hidden. If I had said seeking the hidden God, okay, it's a personal theological essay. I'm making a statement that often God is hidden from me. But Heschel, God bless him, has a chapter in his book, Man is Not Alone, called The Hiding God. And he talks about this. And he has a line, you know, Heschel tended to write poetic lines rather than discursive, rational prose. And he has a line in an essay about prayer. It's called On Prayer. And he says, why do I pray? Quote, God is hiding and we are defying. We human beings are defying. God is hiding and we are defying. And so I knew that for Heschel, as for Eliezer Berkovitz and others, God was not simply hidden, God was hiding. There's agency there. And if you asked him why, he would say, I don't know. But I often try to picture the terror of Abraham Joshua Heschel getting out of Poland by the skin of his teeth, saved by Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, sitting in Cincinnati where he can't eat in the cafeteria because it's treif at the Reform Movement Seminary, wondering if his family back in Poland are still alive, and then discovering at the end of the war, no, the Nazis have killed every single one of them. And he is not going to believe, thank God, that God did that. God did not save him and kill his family. So that gave me courage to think about it this way.
I'll add 2 things. One, and this is along the lines of Yitz Greenberg's most recent theology, the idea of the hiding God and where there's agency, that God is purposely hiding God's self and seeing that not as a betrayal or an abandonment, but seeing it as what good parents need to do, which is ultimately we bring children into the world not so that they'll do everything that we tell them to do. Michael Rosenach wrote a wonderful essay on the difference between education and indoctrination. Said they use most of the same tools, right? But the purpose of indoctrination is get people to obey. The purpose of education is for people to make free choices. And God is a good teacher and brought the world into being because ultimately God wants human beings to take responsibility, right, for the world. I think the place where this is desperately important, and probably, we don't have to go into a political conversation, but a really important part of your book that I very much appreciated was this wrestling with God's role in history. And to me, there's incredible danger and arrogance in voices that are trying to, especially October 7th in Jewish history was a second ago, okay? The creation of the state of Israel was like a minute ago. The Holocaust was a minute and a half ago, right? These are events of such incredible epic proportion that to try to claim to know what God's role in that scope of history is incredible arrogance and hubris and very, very dangerous. When I did this fellowship in Jerusalem, I became enamored for a while. I studied with Danny, he does Levinas at Hebrew University.
Don't know.
Okay. Anyways, we studied Levinas and Leibovitz, and both of them are extreme in saying it is obscene to claim that God has anything to do with history after the Holocaust. Right? It is obscenity. It's blasphemy. And I wrote a paper about this. Michael Marmer, who's I think the dean now out of HUC in Jerusalem.
He was the provost, and he's retired.
He's retired, but a Heschel scholar.
Yeah, Heschel scholar.
And he just very gently said, I want to steer you away from these extremist philosophers who you're reading, right? Like these are two people who are like, incredible, like they're way, way over here. And it's an important voice to be part of it. But there are other people who are navigating a closer middle road. And we need the middle road, which is, I'm not going to ignore this is David Hartman. I can't worship a God who lies. I'm not going to ignore the fact that I live in a time when the state of Israel exists. I can't ignore the fact that I live in a time after the death of 6 million Jews, and those things should influence my relationship with God. But I'm also not going to give answers. I'm not going to proclaim that I have answers. And I think you navigate that very beautifully and importantly.
Can I add one thing here? That this is going to sound pretentious. I don't mean it to. In my own eyes, it's pretentious because I'm not a philosopher. And there's a philosophical issue, which I'm aware of and I read about, which I think plagues all of us. And that is the difference between what we call pluralism and what we call relativism. And that difference means everything to me. And it's not clear to many people, particularly to students. So to say what the rabbi just said, he says as a pluralist. If he were a relativist, he would say, there's no such thing as truth. I'm right, you're right, everybody's equally right. There's no such thing as good with a capital G and evil with a capital E. You think your way, I think my way. It's all cultural, or even it's all personal. It's subjective. That's what a relativist would say. And unfortunately, when I taught at Stanford for 20 years, I found that many of my students were relativists. And we had a great philosopher named Richard Rorty, who was teaching at Stanford, who was a determined relativist. That's just your view, and that's not my view, but we shouldn't fight about it, so let's just agree we're going to get along, and you're going to say what you think. But my students were convinced there were wrongs in the world. Racism was wrong, sexism was wrong, and now for many students, Zionism is wrong. So the relativists are not relativists at all. They have rather firm beliefs. I may not agree with these particular beliefs I just named, but I don't want them to be relativists. I want them to know the difference between a pluralist believes there is absolute truth, and I'm going to stake my life on some things being true, particularly moral truths. I hope we don't have to kill each other over these things. But I'm not going to claim that I have the whole truth. There's other truths than mine. There's value in other traditions than mine. There's value in other ways of being in the world. There's value in other ways of being a Jew, other ways of being a human being. And that lesson is so hard, and so many people are confusing it. And I fear I fear that what we're seeing right now in our politics is the extreme reaction against perceived relativism. Okay, we're going to tell you what's right. Boom, might is going to be right. Force is going to be right. Instead of trying to argue our way and reason it and compromise and find a way to get along, e pluribus unum, we're going to find some way, despite the pluralism of living as one nation, we're going to clamp down and say, no, this is going to go and not something else. And I fear that doesn't help us as a nation, and it doesn't help Jews when Jews start excluding other people and saying, you're bad Jews. No, you're bad Jews.
I want to just add one piece, right? You have over here relativism, you have over here people, Nietzsche makes right.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important for people who are not in either of those camps to articulate what I would call a strong liberalism, right? Let me put it, I'll give you by way of analogy. When you're raising a child, I did say we want to educate our children to make their own choices, but I don't actually mean that whatever choices my child makes, I'm completely fine with.
That's right.
If my child, I raise them and they think about it and they reason everything and they say, I would like to be a murderer, right? My answer to that is no, right? That's wrong. I'm not okay with that. You've made a bad choice. And I'm willing to say you've made a bad choice. And liberal societies, both in Israel and in the United States, have an obligation to say, we don't actually think that any and every education, just because people are choosing it, is okay. We actually believe in liberalism. We actually are willing to say a education system that teaches oppression is wrong. And we believe that we need to educate for education systems that help people to make free choices and not unfree choices.
So I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to open it up to the audience. Good. But the question comes because Pesach is upon us, yep. And you write so evocatively, beautifully, really, about Passover and particularly about the Seder. And I think you have some really interesting ideas about the Seder being a theological statement that I think could be really helpful for us to think about as we move into this holiday. So what does it mean to say that the Seder is where we do our theology?
I wrote the first chapter about Passover because that's how I found my voice. I imagined myself sitting with my friends and family at a Passover Seder, and we're talking about the things you talk about at a Passover Seder, which is this really true that God is a redeemer? Did it happen then? Could it happen now? What does it mean? Up until a couple of years ago, I would sit at a synagogue like this one, and I would say, quote, Passover is Jews' favorite holiday. Everybody loves Passover. And my wife was sitting in the second row, as she is right now, and she said, women do not love Passover. Right? And I have learned my lesson. So I won't say that, but I love Passover.
I love Passover too.
And I do not do most of the cleaning. Why I love Passover is because it introduces us, it puts us in the middle of this discussion, the best way to have it, which was sitting around a table with food. You want to bring people together, put food on the table. So in this case, you put a certain set of symbols on the table. We have it on a certain night of the year. And then we gather together to ask, why are we here? What is the meaning of having these symbols on this table? But then I try to say how the Seder engages in theological discussion even more subtly than that. You start with Kiddush. Have you ever noticed the dozens of theological claims that are made just in that little Kiddush prayer? Right? It talks about the Exodus from Egypt. It talks about God commanding us. Right? There's all sorts of things that are happening just by blessing God right there. And we just run by it because we know we've got a whole Seder ahead of us. So we're starting off with Kiddush. But the rabbis don't have us sitting in a room reading philosophical or theological texts, talking about what it might mean to have God existing and whether God can be good. No, they don't do that. They put us in the middle of a ritual around a table with food and people we love, and the absences of people who used to be around the table and are dearly missed this year because they're not there with us anymore. So it's an emotionally high point. And in this great forum, that's where God is in the room, and we're talking about whether God did or did not, and in what way exercise a redeeming voice and hand in Egypt, and whether we can join God in redemption now. And I love, if I could just throw in one little piece about why my favorite word in the Passover Seder is lefichach, and therefore. Right? After you've been busy talking about what it means for God to have redeemed in some way the Jews in Egypt, therefore it's our obligation. Now, it's true, the rabbis wrote this as if what our obligation is to praise God in all sorts of ways. But I am of the opinion that God does not need us to praise God. God needs us to do God's will in the world. God needs us to do in the world what God wants done, which is justice and compassion. So my lefichach is, once you've now recognized that you've been saved, go out there and save other people. You've recognized that you've been redeemed. Go redeem other people. And I just love the way the Torah, the Haggadah brings us to that point. And so I made the first chapter of Passover because the Passover was my greatest theological lesson. That's how I believe, learned theology.
That's beautiful. And the Passover, the Seder draws us to ask questions, which I think is
Which we've been saying here is that how could we not ask questions? We don't have the answers.
Right.
But that's why I made the point about pluralism and not being relativism. We shouldn't allow people to think that Judaism does not have any answers. It doesn't have ultimate answers about the nature of God, but the things it insists upon of justice and compassion and love, and there's all sorts of things, wisdom about connecting yourself to generations past and generations future. This is not the mindset of many other people in the world. So there's something special about this.
Beautiful. Rabbi Greyber, did you want to say a word about that?
I'll add one other thing, again, from the year that I was in Israel at Mendel, studied Wittgenstein's theory of language, and I think I can make this relevant, I promise. So,
no, can you make it clear?
Right, can I make it clear? What he basically says is that, you have the phonemes, letters, right? They give you a word, okay? So if you have the word cup, okay? But what they need, in order to understand the word cup, you have to have lots of experiences with, I'm cupping my hands. That's a cup of flour, a cup of water, right? A coffee cup, right? And once you have enough experiences with the letters and with the word cup, then you can then you know what a cup is, right? And this is why the Passover Seder works. Because if I try to explain to you the Passover Seder, and you wrote beautifully about it, but ultimately you should not take this personally, but this book will fail, okay, if you don't add to the book experiences. You wrote a beautiful thing about Passover Seder. It's one of the reasons when we have conversion students, hey, I say to all of them, okay, Passover's coming up. You got to get to a Seder. It only comes once a year. Okay. And you can't go through this process of converting to Judaism. And this isn't about drawing boundaries. This is about if you're going to really understand a Seder, you have to go to a Seder. If you're going to understand the word Shabbat, you have to fill in the word Shabbat with dozens and dozens of experiences of Shabbat in different communities, in your own home, in this home, right? And a lot of, I'll just say, I think a lot of the challenge of conservative Judaism now is that in the beginning of the 20th century, conservative Judaism was founded by people who were full of experiences and they needed to be liberated from dogma, right? Which is why those professors, they felt that they were liberating these yeshiva bachers by saying, you don't have to swallow this stuff that people have shoved down your throat in order to be a good Jew. The problem that we have now is a different problem. It's that we are third and fourth generation away, and that we are raising children, and we are communities of people who don't have full sets of experiences. We don't have enough sidarim under our belt. We don't have family. And this is how I was raised. I didn't know how to clean for Pesach. Right? I'm not mad at my mom. Mom, if you're listening, I love you very much, right? But we didn't clean the house we didn't search for chametz. We didn't get rid of it. So I had to learn it from a book. I needed to, Jen and I had to figure it out ourselves, right? And the most important thing, this part of I actually don't love Pesach so much. I do the koshering. I don't do a lot of the cleaning, but I do the koshering. But I struggle with the holiday because I don't live in a world, I'm very alienated from the story because I don't live in a world where plagues happen right now. And I know I can be, for me, Purim, right, is theologically, I resonate with it a lot more. But this aspect of it is incredibly important. And it's why it is very important to me in this synagogue. I think it was Avram Infeld who said, you measure the success of a synagogue by what happens in people's homes. Okay? And when you come to this shul, and what I think we succeed, I gave you a tour this morning, and I brought you around, and there's a Chavurah minyan there, and this minyan, and the Orthodox minyan, and there's Kiddush and everything. We are creating Shabbos, right? And you need to be able to walk into a building and have the experience of the experience in order for the words of the tradition literally to be comprehensible, right? And so that experience piece of it, this is why camp is so vitally, vitally important, right? And it is why, as much as, I joke around, right, that it's the rabbi's sermon, but it's why the words are among the least important things. It's the doing. Because if there isn't the doing, right, then the words literally for Wittgenstein don't mean anything.
Okay. We're going to take a few questions.
I'll just emphasize question. Please ask a question.
Yes, thank you. Please, in the form of a question. Bernie.
Yeah. Sort of a personal question, and I'm not sure you can answer it directly, but when you're looking at the prayers, most of them consist of either praising God in some way or expressing gratitude. And so when you're praying, you're reading all this. How do those two things that are in the prayers affect the way you feel toward God? In other words, your theology, because I think I agree with. Oh, okay. Well, I'm asking for your philosophy about prayer. When you're praying, what are you thinking?
I'm just going to repeat that for those who couldn't hear. When you're praying, what is going on in your mind?
That is such a hard question to answer. And I'm teaching a theology class at JTS, and the last 2 weeks we've been talking about the theology of prayer. So I think that what I'm trying to do when I pray, I just switched, you notice, from first person plural to first person singular. I started saying what we're doing, and I corrected myself and said what I'm doing. Some of the time, trying to put myself into consciousness of if I could actually imagine what it would be to stand before my Creator, the Lord of the universe, who expects things from me, and to keep my sense of God's presence vital for me, so that I remember that life is serious and I have blessings that enable me to do good, and I should be doing good. And when I ask myself the question of why do I have to keep saying these words over and over and over again, my answer to myself is that over and over and over again, I suffer from the doubt that there's no way to repair this world of ours, and that I am not equipped to do it anyway because I'm not worthy. So I find the prayers as kind of a reassurance by commanding me to say these things, which our tradition has done, by commanding me to say these things and things like these, as you said, to praise and to bless and also to request that I'm needy. I don't have all I need. I'm trying to remember what it is that we're here to do. And I'm going to avoid your question for a minute by saying one more thing about prayer. I benefited from the teaching of a very wise rabbi named Jack Moline. He was a rabbi in Alexandria, Virginia for many years. And Jack was teaching a session of rabbis about prayer. And he said, let's all focus on 3 or 4 words. Pick 3 or 4 words that mean a lot to you and try to explain why they meant a lot to you. And then the group of us, there was about a dozen of us in the room, over a period of a week, spent 20 minutes talking about each of these 3 or 4 word phrases that were important to rabbis. So I've tried to identify a handful of those 3 or 4 word phrases in the Siddur. And let me tell you, they're highlights of the Siddur for me. Every time I encounter them, it's like they're in boldface or they're in color and the rest of the words are not. And it's like encountering a friend. I'm going through this prayer book, which means a lot to me anyway. All of it does, because I've been using it since I was a kid. These words have been in my mouth, as we say, right? Because since I was a kid, I've been saying these words. And when I came to write the book, I recognized that the Siddur meant more to me than I ever thought it did. Well, surprise, surprise. Of course it means a lot to you. You've been saying these words since you were a child. And now that I say these phrases, I come across them. One of them is, I'll share, I won't go into the explanation of what it means to me, but just recommend that you focus on it. Kulam ahuvim, kulam brurim, kulam giburim. Just those 6 words. And those 6 words mean everything to me now. And I didn't notice them. I went through 60 some years of my life without even noticing them. And now they mean absolutely everything to me. So I recommend that exercise of identifying a handful of words, focusing on them as we're meditating on them. And that brings the Siddur to life in a way it doesn't happen when you're just going through thousands and thousands of words as if they're all equally important.
Thank you.
And
you know what? I'm gonna because we're at time. We're just gonna take a couple more questions.
can I jump in real quick?
Yeah.
So the meaning of kulam ahuvim,
Sorry.
all of
That's
them
my fault.
beloved,
All of them beloved.
all of them clear, birurim, sort of refined, clarified, and kulam giburim, all of them strong. Okay, I'm going to just say 2 quick things. Bernie, maybe on my next sabbatical, I need to finish the book, but I have about, I don't know if you have this in your computer, I have an introduction and 5 or 6 essays about experiences of prayer, which is, and I want to finish this book because to teach people about how to pray, I actually think that it's the question you're asking has never really been answered well, right? I don't think that I don't think that by learning the Siddur, you can pick up the skill of what does it mean to pray, because people are floating in lots of different places when they're saying these prayers, right? And I'm going to give an answer, excuse me, I'm going to give an answer that builds on something that Professor Summer spoke about during his weekend with our community in December, which is that for me, I want to acknowledge there is a piece of Jewish prayer, of traditional Jewish prayer, that especially when, again, we didn't get it growing up. And I didn't get it growing up. I want you to know that. And I worked hard in my 20s when I was in Israel and when I came back, and to become what I would call shigura b'fi, that the words of prayer are fluent in my mouth. But it can be very alienating when you don't when you don't know the words by heart, when you don't have it fluently. And the reason, but here I want to say, I'm actually looking for a decentering experience. What Ben talked about is Jewish prayer, right? One of the origins of Jewish prayer is the sacrifices. And the sacrifices had a very clear form. And the idea was do it this way and don't improvise, okay? Because if you improvise, that's dangerous. And the community is enacting a ritual, right? That is our way of bringing forth an offering, right? Of coming close to God. And when I'm saying all of these words, the truth is that I'm trying to daven the words as an offering and as a gift. And I let go of trying to actually have an experience of meaning, because it's impossible, right? We're reading 80 or 100 pages every single way, right? You can't mean every word that you say. But in the same way as Buddhist traditions have a meditation of just focusing on Om or on one syllable or on a few things, because it's beyond the words, right? Judaism has a lot of words, but the point is not the words, right? The point is that it's beyond the words and it's a form that's been given to us. And I'm trying to decenter my ego and my own experience, and I'm trying to contribute to the communal offering that we are giving over in that moment.
I can't
Not all
resist.
the time, right? But I just want to offer that as a mode.
So I want to step back and say that prayer, I think, is the single most difficult thing that Jews are asked to do in the contemporary world. And for various complicated historical and political reasons, we are organized in the modern West as a religion, analogous to Christianity or Buddhism and Hinduism. And that doesn't work for Jews entirely. We're not just a religion. And yet here we are in America as a religion, and the major Jewish institution, which I believe is the institution on which our community depends, on which our future depends, is the synagogue. And the synagogue, despite all of its other functions, is known primarily because people come there and they pray. And given who American Jews are at this moment, it's not surprising that over 60% of American Jews do not belong to a synagogue, and that even the conservative Jews and Reform Jews who do belong in a synagogue don't visit them very often. The average conservative Jew does not come to synagogue more than once a month. So Jews are voting with their feet, and it's not surprising because it's an alien form for us. This idea that you're talking to a God who ostensibly can hear the words you're saying. It takes a certain amount of education. You have to learn some of the things that Rabbi Greyber and I have been saying here and get practiced in them and find meaning in them. And that takes time and it takes effort. And it's not surprising that most American Jews are not there. So we are in a bind. We're in a bind. That we're trying to hang together as a community and guarantee our future. And we're dependent on this institution called the synagogue, which is in turn dependent on this practice called prayer, which is alien to the vast majority of American Jews and which is not easy for most of us. I speak for myself. It's not easy. So I think this is, I don't have a solution to this. I've been wrestling with this problem my entire adult life. None of us has found a solution to this yet, but there's something in recognizing the problem and trying to make our synagogues vital communities where more goes on than just prayer. And I know that this place is doing that. And that's the secret of success. You can't just be about prayer in order to be a thriving Jewish institution today. And we as a community cannot just be about prayer in order to guarantee our future.
No, I think we're going to take one last question because we are over time. Jennifer's been holding. I know Batya had a question too.
Well, my question is this. I mean, in thinking about what actually led me to be a religious person and a Jew, because I was brought up essentially without any religion because my mother had no use for religion, and my father was Christian and kept his mouth shut for fear of getting yelled at by my mother. What really led me to become religious was 3 visions and 2 very accurate prophetic dreams. How many people are able to rely on that?
So your question is about prophetic dreams. Okay.
Well,
I haven't had any.
Okay.
Have you?
so I'm going to answer in the following way. No, not prophetic dreams to my knowledge.
Did you have a question?
But I will say, and I wrote about this in the book, that when my friend Jay died, I went off into the desert with Woodges and had too much wine and wandered away from the campfire and howled and it was a howl that came from within me. And I collapsed in the middle of the desert crying. And I felt God's presence comforting me between the stars and the darkness. And that wasn't enough to sustain me. But it was a beginning that pushed me to this process of learning to bring God's presence into my life in more than an episodic way. And so the truth is that I think that the ritual and stuff like that is very important, etc. Elliot Dorff used to say that, prayer is like baseball, that if you get a hit 3 out of every 10 times that you're up,
Right.
then you're in the Hall of Fame. And if you get a home run 1 out of every 20 times, you're in the Hall of Fame. And it's why it's important to do it a lot. But if you never have an experience, I actually think it's really hard. And we can't control that. But I do believe that, and I think we need to also work constantly on opening ourselves up, right, to the possibility of an experience with the divine.
Yeah.
But I also want to name that if that's not something we've ever had the gift of having, right, then, yeah, it's really hard. Really hard.
Okay, let's have one last question from Batya.
I wanted to take you back to Purim, a book of Esther, which in her name is the hiding God. And I wanted to hear from you. I'll have to read your book, of course, but to hear what's your take on this. And just to connect it to the last question about prayer, we hear a lot of prayer by Esther.
I think that Batya is asking, can you reflect on the book of Esther and how its themes weave their way into your book? And also maybe the question also is, you talked about Passover, you talked about Yom Kippur.
What about Purim?
So for those who didn't understand the Hebrew reference there, so Esther is cognate verbally with this word hester panim, the hiding of the countenance. And the rabbis saw immediately that God's name does not appear in the book of Esther, right? So we have a book of the Bible in which God's name does not appear, except for the rabbis understood God has hamakom, right? And Mordechai tells Esther that if you don't rise to the occasion, help will come from some other place, right? So it's from makom acher. So it's going to be God's name. I was instructed about the significance of the book of Esther a long time ago by Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, who wrote beautifully about it. And for those of you, he has a book called The Jewish Way, and there's a chapter on Purim in his book, The Jewish Way. And he says basically this is the most serious and terrifying book in the Bible. Because what it is, it's about Amalek. It's about how the Jewish people are always going to face Amalek. And Amalek always wins. And how do we get saved in the book of Esther so that we can sit here thousands of years later, as it were, and read the book and have a feast and get dressed up in costumes? Because Esther wins the beauty contest and the king can't sleep and Mordecai, etc., this whole series of coincidences, if that's what they are, that result in this. And to me, this is a scary book because we're still living it. And that we in diaspora, being that Mordechai and Esther were in diaspora, we live it more directly than people in the land of Israel do, because the Israelis, for better or worse, if they have enemies, can mount an army and fight these enemies. And we are dependent on whatever version of King Ahasuerus we happen to have, and whatever beauty contest happens to be held to get the king involved in saving the Jews. So it's a really difficult and frightening book, and you could say it's a happy book because it has a happy ending. The bad guys lose, the good guys win. Let's eat, right? Let's celebrate. But you know that it's not the last time, and this won't be the last time. And so one doesn't want to end on a note like this. One has to end on a note of happiness.
Yes.
And so here we are with this wonderful tradition approaching Pesach, and we celebrate Purim and we celebrate Pesach, and we want to be able to affirm this is a wonderful tradition. What a wonderful way to be a human being. Ashreinu matov chalkeinu. It's not that other people aren't as good, but we're very thankful that this is what we have with us as we go through life and seek the hiding God.
And also, I want to note that your book is very hopeful because you point throughout the book to ways that we get glimpses of God. And I think one of my favorite part of the book is something you alluded to last night when your first child was born, and the ecstatic reaction that you had in that moment. And you share it so personally, so beautifully, about dancing around the room and singing the Supremes and thanking God. And that was a moment that I'll take with me from your book.
I'm glad.
And I think these genuine moments, and I think what you teach us in this book is that actually those glimpses are available to all of us. And you're giving us a path forward by which we can open ourselves to those glimpses of the hiding God.
I'll add a word of conclusion. You know, the book of Esther, we always have to ask ourselves the question, not only why does a book open the way that it opens, but why does it close the way that it closes? And the book of Esther closes with a very strange chapter 10. And the message of chapter 10, what does it say? It says, King Ahasuerus placed a tax. And what's the message of that? It is actually that King Ahasuerus was still in charge, right? That all of this drama unfolded, but you can expect it to happen again. And that is a negative note. Right? And I really appreciate the fact that, by the way, the rabbis, when there's a leap year, you add 2 months of Adar, and we celebrate the holiday of Purim always in the second month of Adar. You could have done the first, but we always do the second. And one of the rabbis says to juxtapose the redemption of Purim to the redemption of Pesach. And I really like this idea that in many ways Purim ends on a negative note. And we can't leave it there, right? That we always follow Purim with Pesach, that we lead to redemption because we ultimately are a people of hope. And I want to say to Professor, Dr., Chancellor, Arnie, Eisen, just a tremendous sense of gratitude for the life of scholarship and the life of movement and giving hope to many students and to many communities of the American Jewish community. And in this book, sharing of yourself and your scholarship and yourself personally, all in the service, I really think, of giving people a hopeful vision of the future. Shabbat Shalom.